My name is Abboud. I was born and raised in Canada, and I completed my PhD in the UK at the University of Exeter. And when I went there to do my doctoral work around 2002, 2003, my interest was in studying illicit cross-border trade between Lebanon and Syria. And so when I went for my first research trip, I figured that would be an extremely difficult topic to study. And at the same time, I saw that there were really interesting things happening in Syria. More specifically, there was this gradual introduction of market mechanisms into the economy, the gradual withdrawal of the public sector from services and from a distributive role. So, I started to see these things around 2003, went again in 2004, and decided to completely change my research topic at that time. And what I was interested in was the impacts of this marketization in Syria. So, on the one hand, I wanted to capture what was new about this. So, for example, the introduction of new banks, new insurance companies, private education, private healthcare, these sorts of things. So I wanted to capture that on the one hand, and on the other hand, I wanted to capture the kind of broader impacts. What did this mean for communities? What did this mean for different classes of people? What did it mean for regime stability and for regime security? So for the last 10 years, basically what I've tried to understand is the impacts of political and economic transformation in Syria underneath this kind of broader umbrella of regime stability and security. One of the misconceptions about the uprising in Syria now is that it's a purely sectarian uprising. You have a Sunni majority, which is sort of leading this revolt against a minoritarian regime run by Alawi community, which is more or less around 10% of the Syrian population. There's very little truth into the sectarian kind of explanation for the uprising. There's much more, I think, truth and explanatory possibility when we look at the impacts of this political economic transformation in Syria. So to give you one example, in the early 90s, the Syrian government decided to privatize all agricultural land. And what that did was it ruptured the relationship that peasants and rural people had with the land, especially in the northeast parts of the region and the southeast parts of the region, which, if you look at where the protests began, were in those areas. And when they ruptured this relationship and started to privatize the land, they initiated this kind of mass movement of rural people from those areas into the outskirts of Damascus and Aleppo, and slum cities started rising in Syria. So from the period of privatizations in the early 90s to the eve of the uprising, there was a depopulation of almost 200 villages in rural Syria, with the movement of more than 2 million people away from these villages. So there was economic dislocation. I mean, there were people that were dependent on the public sector, were dependent on a particular use of the land. When that relationship was ruptured, they were forced away from those areas. Many of the protesters come from these impoverished areas that were more or less neglected in the context of this marketization that started occurring after 2000. Basically, government policy did absolutely nothing to target them and to create conditions for their kind of socioeconomic betterment. In fact, what government policy did was disenfranchise them, disempower them. And I think that when you consider the locations of the protests outside of the cities and then slowly moving into the cities, you see that those are the poorest areas in Syria. Those are the areas most neglected by government policy, most neglected by investment, the areas that have historically been politically and economically underrepresented within the country. And then, of course, over time, I mean, the uprising is in it's almost a year and a half now. Over time, of course, the brutality of the regime's response invites more and more people to join the protests, not out of purely sectarian reasons. Of course, there's a sectarian element to it, but many of the reasons behind The protests are structural, that people are frustrated with their lack of economic prospects. There's many people who are on the periphery, the extreme periphery of the marketization policies. And of course, it's an authoritarian system, and there's no means of mobilization other than on the street. Certainly it was initially inspired by it. There was anti-regime propaganda which appeared in Dar'a, which is in the south, and there was this brutal response by the regime. The children who put up the propaganda were in their teens, early teens. There was a brutal response, and then it sort of snowballed. So of course there was some inspiration. One of the major differences is that the Syrian regime has remained cohesive. That is, its political apparatus and its security apparatus have remained relatively coherent and cohesive throughout the uprisings. If you consider what happened in Egypt and Tunisia, for example, you had the Tunisian army almost immediately saying, we're not going to fire on our citizens, which removed the oppressive arm of the regime, and the arm without the army, without the repression of the army, the Tunisian regime had to collapse, and you had this kind of political transition process that was initiated almost immediately. In Egypt, the army remained the power broker, but told Mubarak that he had to go. And so you see, after Mubarak leaving, you have this kind of decapitation almost of one figure in the regime, but you have the continuity of the regime itself expressed through the Supreme Military Council in Egypt. In Syria, you have no such disunity within the regime. There's no such rupture so far, and it's happening, but there's no such rupture between the political and the security apparatus. So the army has remained relatively cohesive, save for a couple of defections of generals. Most of the soldiers who have defected were conscripts anyways. And the intelligence apparatus has remained extremely loyal to the regime. And for those reasons, the regime has been able to sort of remain in power now. Now, it remains in power through its repressive apparatus, and it's completely lost the power to govern the country. It's a misconception that this is Alawi or an Assad family regime. Historically speaking, the Ba'ath Party that emerged after the 70s, after Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, led what was called then as the corrective revolution. Historically, the leadership was rural minoritarian and mostly Alawi dominated from the northwest parts of the country. What happened by the 1980s is that this rural minoritarian leadership came to the strategic conclusion that it had to begin incorporating different social forces into its ruling bargain, if you will, into the social contract. And what it did so through two primary mechanisms. One was through the economy. It started opening up different possibilities for the traditional urban Sunni families who had perhaps maybe lost out because of the nationalizations in the 50s and 60s. So they started to slowly cultivate this social force again and bring them back into the ruling bargain. They also started intermarrying. So political elites started marrying people from the economic elite, and security elites started marrying, the sons and daughters of all these elites started marrying. And what you had in the 80s was the beginning of a process of kind of fusion between the political, economic, and security elite. And then you started to see a lot of crossover. So you had people whose the sons and daughters of political officials of the political elite who started entering into business. So one of the ways in which we can understand the process of marketization in Syria is the process of kind of expanding the means for this group of people to accumulate wealth. So over time, there was this kind of bringing in of different social forces that expanded the overall base of the regime. At the same time, many of the minorities within Syria, such as the Christians or the Shia or the Druze, their loyalty was cultivated in, I think, more strategic ways, not only through the economy, but through their mobilization in other institutions and other social institutions. And while the regime has historically and even today never spoken in sectarian terms, it's always played a sectarian game. And it's always, it is often presented itself as the defender of minorities. Between 1979 and 1982, there was a low-level civil war in Syria between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Ba'athist regime. In 1982, there was kind of a decimation of Hama, and the Brotherhood leadership went into exile, and that sort of ended the civil war, if you will. And from that moment on, the regime has always been able to say to the minorities, look, we can defend you against some sort of radical Islamist agenda. And so this partly explains the kind of social or political cohesion of the regime. The other way we can, or another factor that we have to account for, is that more than 25% of employed Syrians are employed in the public sector. It's a huge constituency for the regime right there that to a large degree prohibits them from mobilizing against the regime. It's kind of a silent, if you will, constituency. That's of course not to say that many people in the public sector are not, many people in the public sector are obviously against the regime and participating in the protests, but that certainly was very strategic on the regime's part to try and maintain some sort of relationship between state and society. One of the things that we don't talk enough about is the kind of Arab Cold War that's been happening for many years now. I should say actually the Middle Eastern Cold War, because of course Iran is part of this. In the context of this kind of regional Cold War, you have states such as Syria, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon is sort of somewhere in between because of its different social and political forces. Do you have those countries which are engaged in, I don't want to call them proxy wars, but conflict, if you will, with other regional states, particularly in the Gulf. So one of the ways in which we can understand American policy, for example, in the last 10 years, or even the policy of Saudi Arabia and countries like Qatar, is through the prism of the kind of Iranian threat. This idea that Iran is going to take over the region, the idea of a Shia crescent from Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. And so much of the regional policy is governed by this kind of imagined threat of something like a Shia crescent or Iranian penetration. So when we look at the Syrian case, it has slowly become a proxy for this regional Cold War. So you have on the one hand states such as Iran, which are openly supporting Syria, Iran, Russia, China, which are openly supporting the regime. Of course, the Russians and the Chinese are providing political cover for them at the United Nations. The Russians, although they just said they're no longer shipping arms to them, up until the day before were quite actively shipping arms, and there's considerable evidence that they're providing them with intelligence support and intelligence information. Iraq, many of the leaders in Iraq have said that they will openly defy the Arab League sanctions against Syria. In Lebanon, something similar is happening as well. Actually, cross-border trade between Iraq and Syria, I think, is actually increasing now because it's been blocked off in other ways. So you have those countries that are basically providing the kind of political and economic support the regime needs to survive, if you will. On the other hand, states such as Qatar and Saudi Arabia and other Gulf allies, Turkey, the United States, and by extension Israel, are providing support to the opposition. Now, the support to the opposition is interesting because the Qataris and the Saudis actually can't agree on which part of the opposition that they want to support. So you see within this kind of regional battle, regional battles. So there are multiple opposition groups that are emerging now that want to claim representation of the revolution, representation of the people. There are, of course, there's the Free Syrian Army, which we know that Qatar and Saudi Arabia are funding quite extensively and providing support for them. We also know that there are Islamists going into Syria that are certainly getting support from the Saudis, if not the Qataris as well. And so, unfortunately, you have this kind of regional element that is fueling the Syrian crisis. It's not clear yet whether this will turn out to be something like Lebanon, like the Lebanese civil war that occurred from 75 until the late 80s, but it's certainly possible given these circumstances. And certainly this suggests that the crisis will be generational in any case. I suppose there's a number of scenarios. Of course, the more recent one that we're familiar with is de-Baathification in Iraq, where 2 million people were kicked out of their jobs, and you had an entire institutional structure that was emasculated. That certainly won't happen in the Syrian case. This regime has proven that it can be cohesive, that it is resilient despite defections. So certainly elements of the regime will be a part of a post-conflict Syria. What part, we don't know. Certainly the opposition and the international community is insisting that Assad doesn't play a part in post-conflict Syria, and I don't think that he will, especially if there is anything resembling regime collapse in that country. He certainly won't be around. There's even there have been reports that even Qatar and Saudi Arabia are trying to facilitate his exit, and Qatar has offered him residency, I believe, to try and sort of get him out. Even if he leaves, if you have that kind of decapitation of the leadership. I mean, recently you had the assassination of the defense minister, the deputy defense minister, and the interior minister, which are, the kind of heart of the security apparatus, and there was no immediate collapse of the regime. So you would certainly have to have elements of the regime participate in a kind of post-conflict Syria. Who in the opposition participates in that, whether it's the opposition in exile, whether it's the domestic opposition, is also a question that we have to think about in the future. One of the canny things that the regime has done is try to cultivate a domestic opposition that is supposedly supportive of the revolution and supportive of the uprising. Whether this over the long term turns out to be just a cosmetic development and you actually do have the emergence of a solid domestic opposition that can participate in a political transition process and from there eventually work to govern the country in 1 or 2 or 3 generations. That's also a scenario. I think the most unlikely scenario is what happened, or what the American government tried to enable in Iraq, which is the imposition of a government in exile. So I think that there will be some combination of oppositionists from exile, oppositionists from the inside, whether they're cultivated by the regime or not, and some regime elements that form what will be a kind of post-conflict Syrian political system. One of the reasons why this kind of regional war is occurring between Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and all these countries is that Syria is seen as being a link within a particular axis. So the Syrians and the Iranians and Hezbollah call it the resistance axis because they are resisting the American-Israeli project in the region. Here in the United States, we call the other axis the moderate axis, the moderate states, so the states of Jordan and Egypt under Mubarak and the Gulf states. One of the one of the reasons why Syria is so strategically important to the Gulf states and why they are funneling so many resources into bringing about regime collapse is that they want to, in this kind of imaginary of the Iranian threat, if you take out the Syrian piece, it all collapses because Syria is kind of integral part of this kind of resistance axis or whatever, the Iranian axis. So the point is to almost totally alter the geopolitics of the region by isolating Iran even more. Will it have long-term immediate implications on the US foreign policy? Of course, yes it will. It will likely not have immediate impacts on the peace process because I think that whatever happens after this conflict, I think something like reconstruction, this kind of new political system, that the energies of the domestic energies and the regional energies will be devoted towards that and less towards peace. So we can expect probably more stalemate on the Golan front. It's unlikely that the regime will engage in a regional war. It's unlikely that the regime will try and, for example, provoke Turkey or provoke Israel into some sort of regional war to escalate this. So I don't anticipate that there will be kind of large-scale war like we saw in the 60s and 70s in the region. But there's likely to be considerable kind of conflict and activity within the country. I don't think there's an appetite for it in the West. And I certainly think, especially after Libya, and seeing what's happened in Libya, I mean, there was an intervention and then everyone just walked away. Within Syria, many of the people within the opposition, whether the violent opposition or the non-violent opposition, have rejected military intervention. One of the suggestions has been for the creation of safe zones, which is just a different form of military intervention. I'm not convinced that military intervention could necessarily bring about the collapse of the regime in the way that it did in Libya because of the cohesiveness of the regime. Whether that changes in a year when oppositionists take control of more territory, we don't know. But I think many people who follow Syria and many people within Syria, even those opposed to the regime, are very, very much against intervention. I don't think there's a regional appetite for it, but the opposition in exile has now adopted it as its kind of principal policy. And I think that it's a bankrupt policy because the oppositionists in exile have proven that they haven't been able to affect political change. They haven't been able to affect political transition or regime collapse. They're having these meetings in regional capitals, and really not much is coming of it. They've had little impact on the ground, and I think they've adopted this the strategy of pushing for military intervention, which is the opposite of what they did, the strategy they adopted at the beginning. I think that they're pushing for this military intervention as a way to demonstrate their usefulness, if you will, or their agency within this process, because they've proven quite incapable of affecting change. But I think in the immediate future, intervention is unlikely, especially after the declaration that they have chemical weapons and whatnot. I answer that with some hesitancy because I am someone who would go and enjoy myself immensely in Syria and leave. For me, it still remains a place that's very close to me, both personally and of course professionally. So I'll do my best to honor what I imagine are the experiences of some people there. So I have family members in Syria, and I have many friends, and I think that they, to some degree, experienced many of the things that any post-colonial society would experience. Development challenges, political challenges, the challenges of living under an authoritarian regime. One of the differences, of course, in Syria is that it was highly mobilized society. So its various institutions were captured by the regime, and there was this kind of, if you will, this embedding of the regime in state and society, if you will. I think for many urban Syrians that they lived, again, kind of this normal kind of post-colonial life. There were some segments of society that had begun to benefit considerably from the market reforms that occurred after 2000. So you had in the urban areas, in Aleppo and Damascus, you had the emergence of a kind of new elite, if you will, that was directly tethered to the market reforms. So they had benefited directly from these market reforms. And so they had really pushed kind of changing landscape in the urban areas. So, Syria is a country where you don't see Starbucks, you don't see McDonald's, but you started to see these kind of fancy schmancy restaurants, fancier coffee shops, fancier bars and clubs that cater to this new elite. And that was certainly one side of what life was like for Syrians. So for many of these people, life was quite good. So many people that I interviewed were actually people who had come to the United States, earned degrees here, had settled here, and once they saw what was happening in their country, returned. They thought life was great in the United States, but we want to go home, and life is also very good for us here. That's the kind of one side of it. The other side is that slowly, with the withdrawal of the state from the kind of service sector, is that people really struggled. And I had one person explain this to me so well. He said, in the 70s, we used to buy property, and now we're selling it just to stay alive. And this is something that I heard over and over again, that there was considerable socioeconomic struggle, even in the urban areas, which is where I had the most experience. And all of this occurs underneath a very oppressive regime, to the point where politics occurs kind of privately, much more privately than it does in neighboring countries like Lebanon. One of my friends would often spit and say to me, whisper to me and say, on Hafiz's head, Hafiz being the father of the current president. He would never have said that publicly in front of somebody else. There were no obvious signs of kind of public mobilization in Syria. You would never have people discussing political issues around strangers, for example. There was a high degree of secrecy. People, depending on your status in society, you can engage in politics. I certainly had extremely political discussions with people of the kind of middle and upper classes, but people who weren't part of those classes were very wary of what they said about the regime, what they said about the security apparatus. There's, of course, a number of conspiracies. There's seemed to be always somebody in the area who they thought was working for the regime. I even remember in the beginning of the uprising, before it had even come close to Damascus, I spoke to a friend of mine, and he said, we can't trust anybody because you'll be talking to somebody on the street, and you'll walk away, and 5 minutes later, somebody from the intelligence apparatus will arrest one of you, and you don't know if somebody heard you talking, through a window, if they were the person that told somebody in the apparatus. And there's real kind of, especially at the beginning of the uprising, and obviously now, real fear of the regime and its apparatus. I remember times where we would sit down to eat breakfast on a newspaper, and my friends would say, don't eat on the pictures of the Syrian flag, just in case somebody comes and says, takes it the wrong way and thinks that we're somehow insulting the regime. So I think life economically was very difficult for the overwhelming majority of Syrians, and politically was quite stifling. That's not to say that they didn't engage in politics, but whenever there were public expressions of politics, like you had after Bashar al-Assad came to power, you had something that was called the Damascus Spring, where a bunch of intellectuals got together and started having these kind of what they called like civil society meetings, where they would meet in somebody's house and talk politics. Well, the regime tolerated it for a couple of weeks, and then the regime started sending in its thugs to break them up. So that was the only kind of means of expressing yourself politically. There's close to 20,000 dead now. It's unclear how many have been injured. What we also know is that millions of people have now been forced to move. And one of the really frightening things about the urban violence now is that the urban areas were the areas where people who were fleeing the rural demonstrations came to. So they would come to family in Damascus or Aleppo, and now, they're almost becoming double migrants, because now many of these people are trying to leave to either go back or to go to places like Lebanon or Jordan or Iraq. So there's of course the massive physical, like, death and injury toll, but then there's also this massive movement of people across the region. In Lebanon, for example, there's Damascene license plates everywhere, because this kind of new elite that had the resources to leave left. You also have many Syrians depleting their assets or relying on family members abroad to help support them. So there's that, and of course there's a constant kind of fear of attacks, of what's coming up, what's next, if anything. Something that we can't ignore, of course, is that many of the oppositionists are also targeting civilians. The Free Syrian Army, I'll say this sort of parenthetical to everything, the Free Syrian Army is not an actual army. There's nothing cohesive about it. It's something, there's a structure there, it's called the Free Syrian Army, and there are different brigades that pledge, or different groups of fighters that pledge allegiance to the Free Syrian Army, but there's no unified command. So what Group A does has nothing to do with what Group B does, and it's all done without any central kind of unifying command. Many of those brigades, or many of those groups fighting under the banner of the Free Syrian Army, are extremely sectarian and are targeting Alawis, targeting minorities, under the guise of targeting loyalist villages and loyalist communities. So you just had in Aleppo, for example, rebel fighters claiming loyalty to the Free Syrian Army, which videotaped the murder of an entire family, because that clan, because that family belonged to a clan that was supposedly loyal to the Assad regime, even though that it was not an Alawi family, actually. So you have a lot of that kind of violence, not just on the part of the regime, of course, but on the part of the armed opposition. A lot of the fighting that is occurring in civilian areas. There's been a number of kidnappings that have occurred. A bus full of Lebanese was recently kidnapped. They took all the men and they kidnapped them, and nobody knows where they are. And the people who kidnapped them claimed loyalty to the Free Syrian Army. So there's the violence of the regime, but there's increasingly the violence of the opposition. So much so that the word for thugs, shabiha, that is used to describe the regime thugs, is now also being used to describe the opposition thugs. And what's happened in that context of extreme violence is that the nonviolent protesters who started this and who are still committed to nonviolence are kind of caught in the middle of this, and their voices completely peripheral, and their ability to affect political change is extremely limited, because of the militarization of the opposition and Syria's entering into a civil war. It's occurring throughout the country. The asset depletion that I referenced a bit earlier is what's helping some people cope, because they don't have the money to buy basic services. The regime is no longer, I mean, the government is no longer functioning in the sense of governing the country. When I read the news every day, I hear these things about, they adopted the eagle, for example, as the animal of the year in Syria, and there's all these campaigns about, the eagle, and I think, how can this possibly be happening? I mean, there's a civil war. How can anyone be thinking about this stuff? But the basic actual governing of the country, picking up the garbage, making sure the water's clean, is becoming extremely difficult because the resources are being devoted to repression. And of course, these things get neglected. At the same time, the regime has tried to revert back to some of its kind of socialist era policies by imposing price ceilings on things. So every day or every week, they publish a price list. So tomatoes can't be above this price, but there's no tomatoes on the market. So everything is being sold, most things are being sold on the black market now well above the price list. So they don't even have the enforcement mechanisms. So, tomatoes have gone up in price. There's a shortage of gas, there's a shortage of heating oil, there's shortages everywhere. And the government is not able to supply that at a subsidized rate because the government itself is basically on the verge of bankruptcy. The sanctions alone, the oil sanctions alone, have cost the country about $3 billion. And the major producer where it received its heating oil from, which is a Greek producer, is no longer distributing oil to the country. So there's massive disruption of revenues, massive disruption in the governance mechanisms. I mean, basic stuff, getting food to plate. Has become extremely difficult, if not impossible. So Syrians are increasingly relying on families, on remittances, on asset depletion, selling off their resources, or in most cases, many of them are leaving. They're trying to find families, trying to find relatives that can support them, to consolidate their resources a bit more. I mean, it's a fully functioning coping economy at this point. There's absolutely no accumulation going on. There's absolutely no kind of business activity. I mean, of course, there's some, but the average Syrians now are more concerned with coping under these conditions and finding resources. There's all sorts of reports about kind of de facto vegetarians now that they can't afford meat, so people aren't. It's changing the diet of people in the urban areas. And with kind of decimation of agriculture through these kind of privatization policies, but also in the droughts in the last couple of years, there isn't a lot of domestic agriculture to be distributed to the communities that need it.